Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a Premier Field Engineer specializing in System Center Technologies. Today's discussion is part 7 of an ongoing series detailing operating system deployment in Configuration Manager 2012. Today's discussion will center on the concept of driver management. There are a few things that I want to talk about. First of all, why is driver management important? And I apologize in advance if I interchangeably use some words. I caught myself talking about drivers as updates, which they're not. And so if I say that, just know I mean drivers and so on, but I'll try not to. So the reason this is an important discussion is because as individuals build systems, image systems, one of the key concerns is to make sure that that build out is to a point where the hardware works. Certainly the most important piece is to make sure the network connectivity is there, but there are other important pieces too, making sure we have the right audio drivers, the right video drivers, the right peripherals and general drivers. And that's what this discussion helps us do, is make sure that when we deliver these machines that they are configured for the end user to use from the very beginning without having to worry. Right? A couple of discussions that I want to have as we detail the topic. First of all, the topic or the idea of importing drivers. How do we do that? How does it work, right? Then various install options for getting those drivers in place. That will be probably the bulk of our discussion. Some discussion on fail-safe planning. What happens if we have a machine and none of the drivers that are needed really are there, right? Really, match or are there, right? So we'll talk about that as well. And it'll be just a really quick sample. It won't be a detailed thing at all, but just to demonstrate what you could maybe do, right? And then finally, talk about drivers and the deployment download options, and then drivers and imaging options as well, and we'll wrap up there, right? So let's get into it. So in terms of importing drivers, we're going to immediately start off just by demonstrating this. I want to talk about 3 items specifically as we go through it. First of all, assigning drivers to a driver package, some implications there, what it means. Assigning to boot images, and then categories. So the best way to talk about it is just to go ahead and pull in my window. In fact, let me use a different machine here real fast to do this discussion. So here's my CAS in this case, doesn't really matter, but here are the drivers, right? So I've got a number of drivers already imported. You'll see on the root level I don't have any. I've got them all categorized in folders and such, as you can tell. So that's the first thing, is it's very easy to categorize your drivers and make them organized. Very, very critical to do that too if you're going to do driver management right. Okay? But in order to get drivers into the driver catalog, we have to import them. So the import option is here. Okay? So I need to just specify UNC, so bear with me while I do that. Hopefully I'm typing right. Okay, so here should be a path, if I typed it right, where my drivers are located on my machine. So notice if I hit a backslash, hopefully that will catch up with me in a minute, I can actually drill in. Let me just show you the folder directly. So this is the folder right here, right? So you notice that I've drilled down specifically to drivers, which is the top level. Inside I have HP, I have Lenovo. I could certainly drill down. HP should actually be Dell, but nevertheless. I could drill down further and specify HP or whatever. I can also, just to make sure that I'm in the right place, I can browse to it, and so on, right? But the point of this is we will import drivers that are nested. There we go. So it finally caught up, right? Okay. So I can import all the drivers. So if I click next, which I will, we'll see drivers from the HP folder. We'll see drivers from the Lenovo folder. You might not want that. You might want to be importing a specific set of drivers that are new to the environment. Probably that's going to be the case most of the time. But just to know that you can do it, right? Or you can import a specific driver by specifying a direct path to that INF file or whatever it is. Okay, And then options that we can choose. I've already got these imported, so I'm going to say do not import, but there are other options for dealing with drivers. that are duplicated. So I'm going to click Next. So we're going to go through those folders and we'll see the various drivers that are available. So you see, for example, we have HP drivers, right? There's some video drivers. Then we have down here the Lenovo driver. So it's definitely pulling from both places. And then I can choose to enable all of these drivers at import or not. I can enable them later. I'll leave those enabled. And what you can also do is assign the categories as you import. Categories are a big deal, and you're definitely going to want to consider categories. Maybe this bulk import, all of these drivers go into a specific category. If that's the case, then doing it here is a convenience, but oftentimes maybe you're just importing a bunch of drivers into the catalog. You want to go back and categorize later, which can absolutely be done. So for now, I'll leave that blank. Click Next. And now we get to choose, do we add, what driver package do we want to add the drivers to? So the question is, what's a driver package? Well, very much like any software distribution, a driver package is a package that contains drivers. Pretty silly answer, but it's true, right? And so you need to have a package that contains your drivers so that we can find them whenever it comes time to install them during the task sequence, right? But the driver package actually does more too. So the driver package is kind of like organization. So you might look at this and think, well, it's kind of like software updates, and it could be. As long as the drivers are in a package that we can pull them from, then we're okay to get them, from that. And if it's a dynamic kind of deployment, you'll see that in a minute, then it's an okay thing to do. But driver packages can also be used for organization, right? There's an option for installing drivers where having the driver packages really maintained well and organized well is important, and you'll see that, right? But for now, I just have two. I'm going to choose to add it to the main driver package just because I know I'm not going to get any. Update distribution point when I'm done. I could also create a new package here if I wanted to, but I don't. And then lastly, I'm going to be asked, do I want to inject these to any boot images, right? So as a reminder, boot images are Windows PE. That is the phase of imaging where we actually do the image deployment. And it's tempting, and I see it happen a lot, that folks will add in drivers, all sorts of drivers, into Windows PE. They'll have audio drivers in there, video drivers, all of those things that in Windows PE just don't matter, right? And so the idea of adding to a boot image is cool if you know that the drivers you're importing need to be added to the boot image. It's one place to do it. But generally, I prefer to add the drivers directly to the boot image by going to the boot image itself, which I'll show you in a minute. Adding drivers that are not necessary to a boot image can just end up bloating that boot image, can cause problems. So what kind of drivers are really necessary for a boot image? The answer to that, really, it comes down to typically NIC drivers and, in some cases, mass storage drivers, right? Generally speaking, those are the two broad categories. You might have some other situations where you need to add drivers in, but definitely you don't need the same drivers in PE that you would need in an operating system that folks will be using for production, right? Okay. Now, so this is the place to add them. I'm not going to choose to, so I can go through the rest of this, and you'll see I'm going to go through very quickly. It won't take long at all. Shouldn't take long at all. Oh, it is taking a bit longer. And we'll load these in, and we'll get the results. I've told it, I believe, not to do anything with it, but nevertheless, we'll see. So while this is running, let me show you the boot images real quick. So if I go to the boot image and go to properties, then I certainly have the ability to add drivers here as well. Just hit the starburst and we can see all the categories, all the drivers we want, right? Maybe I would want to add a SATA controller, or something, right? But that's how you can do it. And then we definitely will need to regenerate the boot image after we're done and so on, right? Okay, so we'll let that finish. So that's really, drivers. Now, in terms of I'm sorry, that's importing drivers. In terms of what you do with the drivers after they're imported, we might want to go back and add a couple of things. So let's go back to these drivers. Right, so I don't have any there. Let's just go to Lenovo because there's just a few. So as you can tell, I can in fact add categories here to the drivers. So if I go and look at the properties of one of these, or edit, I can go edit the driver package or edit the boot images if I want to here, but I can look at properties on the driver itself. I can see detail, first of all, is this an enabled driver, right? What is the driver source? Why would I care whether it's enabled? Well, it could be that you're importing drivers into the catalog that you don't yet want to be available to systems to download and use in imaging. That's a possibility. Could also be that you have drivers that are in the catalog that you are using for ongoing imaging, but you notice there's a problem with one of the drivers, so you could disable it and make sure that it doesn't install on systems going forward until you get that figured out. Right? So there may be others that I'm not thinking about, but that's certainly an option that you can choose. You can assign the drivers. You can see what it is. First of all, you can assign the drivers to categories like we talked about. Having categories will be very important for you as you do some of these imaging scenarios. Right? Some drivers you might not want to have in categories. That's fine. Or you might want to bulk add certain drivers to categories after the fact. You can do that too, as I'll show you in a minute. You can see what kind of applicability is set for the driver, right? What kind of OSs and such. Where the driver is actually being stored. In this case, it's in both driver packages, security, and so on. So if I wanted, I could actually set the categories on multiple drivers at a time. So if I want to, for example, say this is an IBM driver, which it's not, but I can say that it is, then I'll go through and categorize it. We'll add those, right? So even after the import, if you have multiple that you want to categorize in the same way, pretty easy to do. All right, so cool. Let's move away from that right now and move on to the next subtext kind of our discussion. So in terms of driver import, there's some easy ways to do it. Most of the time, drivers are pretty easy to figure out how to import. Sometimes they're challenging, right? Let's talk about both scenarios. So in terms of importing drivers, let's pull this back in. So when I did the import, I had to know where my drivers were. There we go, it failed. That's not really a failure, it's just because they were already in the catalog. But I had to know where to point the wizard to import the drivers, right? So that means that in order to have the drivers in this folder, I had to obtain the drivers from somewhere, right? So the way I did this, the way you'll most likely do it for most drivers, is I simply got the software, and I ran it, right? So whenever I run the software, it's going to ask me, for example, where do I want to extract it? Right? Where do I want to install it? So I could tell it, I could let it run, and what you'd see is after the end of running this wizard, you'd get two things. You would have the drivers unpacked and available to you, so you could move them into the folder like I have here, drivers. And you will also see, in this case, the case of this particular installer, it would actually go up and try to start the install of the driver for you, optionally. And you could simply just run the wizard, get the driver files unpacked, and then just cancel the install. That's what I did, right? Here's another way. This is from Lenovo. This is the same thing. Just supply the path, and we'll unpack the drivers, and then you can use them, right? So if you look inside my drivers folder, you'll see a number of files, some of them probably extraneous to what we want. But the nice thing is once you get the files, the source available to the wizard will scan through all of these files and figure out what the relevant driver files are, and then you can import them, right? Having extra files, all it does is take disk space, but the wizard helps clean that up whenever it imports into ConfigMgr. Now, not all drivers are easy to import. Right? There are some challenging scenarios. I don't really have any to show, but I can talk about at least a couple I've seen. Right? So it could be that you have a driver that's supplied as an exe. The manufacturer might expect that you would install that driver simply by running the exe. And what happens, I mean, sometimes it's not even this easy, but oftentimes when we run an installer, like when we run an MSI installer, I don't know if this will do it. Let's see if it will. When I run this MSI installer, or this exe here. Let's see if it'll do it. Probably not, but let's just see. Yeah, actually it's going to do it after I select the file, so that this is not a good test. But a lot of exes or whatever, when you run them, one of the first things they do is unpack the files that they'll need to run, and you'll be able to find oftentimes the unpacked files on the root of the C and kind of a long jumbled set of characters for the folder name and so on. Well, if that's the case, you can simply scrape all those files out of that temporary folder and move it to a place where you can import from there, and generally that will work. Right? Sometimes it won't. Sometimes there are other challenges, like maybe the files when they unpack, there's no driver there. Maybe there's a file within the unpacked files that itself needs to be unpacked in order to get at the file. Seen that on occasion, right? In either case, some of these can be challenging, but I've never really run across a situation where I can't get the drivers out of the system to get them imported to ConfigMgr for deployment, right? So, but that said, there definitely could be some challenges. All right, so let's move past that for a minute. Pull the lab back out. Oh, and then there's the question: what do we import, right? So the answer is really import whatever you need. The goal of this is to make sure you have enough drivers for the end user system to be fully operational, a good end user experience when the system is built, right? And we can certainly import audio drivers, video drivers, mouse drivers, keyboard drivers, whatever driver that you deem necessary. The only caveat, as I mentioned earlier, just don't put all those in PE. It's not necessary, right? But it might be something you want on the end user's machine, and that's certainly possible. All right, so enough talk about this. The easiest way to really understand it is to go see it. There are 3 scenarios. There could be more, right? You could actually build a run command line to do all of this manually if you wanted to. That's generally not such a common step, right? But you could. These are the 3 scenarios for driver installation, driver management that ConfigMgr offers for you. There's 2 steps that will automatically identify and apply drivers for you, and the third where you just basically have complete control over the process. I'll show you all 3 of these and also show you how you can see some of the differences, and then we will move on to a couple of other things and wrap up. All right, so for the first one, auto-apply drivers. Let me pull in my my lab environment. Let me go get the right one. Oops, there we go. So I'm going to shift to my primary site for this. Oops, let me not do that. There, that's the machine I want. So here I have a few demo task sequences that I put together. The first one is just the auto-apply driver step. So if I look at the edit on this, I'll see this step, apply device drivers. This is the way it comes by default. This is how it's configured. And you'll see a couple of options. For each hardware device, install only the best match compatible drivers. That is by default. Or you can install all compatible drivers, which then the operating system will figure it out once it launches, right? And then also notice consider drivers from all categories. So any driver you have imported to the catalog will be factored in to the matching, right? So this is a dynamic situation. So the machine will be imaging. After the image is deployed, while we're still in Windows PE, that's key, we're going to try to figure out the drivers that are necessary for the hardware on that box, right? We're going to send that up and then ask the site to give us a best match for that hardware in this case. So it truly is a plug-and-play scenario. You really don't have any control. Any driver that's in the catalog could be identified as necessary and pulled down, right? So honestly, this is a step that I really don't like. I mean, it generally works pretty well, but I prefer to have a little bit more specificity over what happens, right? So of the 3, this is the one I like the least, although it does work well in a lab environment and things like that, right? So let me show you this running. But before I do, I want to set up a couple of things. So I want to show you the end-to-end process of how this works. So what I've got is a system that's already in the process of imaging. I've paused it. Let me pull this out and get that system in. So here it is, bare metal here. So this system is kind of paused in the process of applying the image because the next step will be to apply drivers. So I want to give us the ability to see this process end to end. So I'm going to pull up SQL Profiler. Now I've already got this configured. It's going to just capture all of the SQL traffic on the SQL server while it runs. As we've talked about before, and if you've been around ConfigMgr for any period of time, you know that the client doesn't do anything really by itself. It has to know how to get certain information certain policies, certain things, right? And the way it does that is by talking to the management point. And there's no difference here. There is a management point component that is involved in pulling down drivers in the auto apply scenarios anyway, right? But the logging for that, as you'll see, isn't real good, but we know there's SQL activity taking place, so I'm going to want to capture that so I can show it to you later. So I'm going to go ahead and start this. It'll just start capturing. That's fine. I'll pull it out and we'll come back to it. So I'm going to go ahead and let this run, right? And I'm going to go ahead and press F8 so I have a command prompt, because I want to show some things in the task sequence log. So I'm going to go ahead and navigate to that. All right, and I'll pull up the task sequence log in Notepad in just a minute. But I'll wait for it. I want to let it get past the driver matching stage. We're almost there. You'll see it come along in a minute. You'll also see it dump out some variables there, but now we're applying the device drivers. We're asking the management point now for compatible drivers. You'll see that in a minute. And then we'll pull down the list. All right, so now we're downloading the client, so we're past the driver matching. So I'll just go ahead and open up the log. There it is. So I can pull this down. Not a problem. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and stop my SQL tracing because it's just capturing stuff that doesn't matter for our discussion right now. Okay, so I can search this log very easily. I know the name of my task sequence steps, and so I can search for that. So I'll search up for apply device. Up. And you see I'm at the end of apply device drivers. I want to get to the first of it. And I restarted. Notice the command window's open. Therefore, when I restart, it won't restart until I close that command window. That's a nice thing of the F8 command prompt. There is actually one way that you can force it to restart even in that case, but it's using a specific command that is outside of the task sequence, WinPE something or other, shut down or whatever, but most people don't do it that way. So I'll go ahead and search up again. So the condition is there. Let me search up. Start executing an instruction, right? Here's where we're starting the section to apply device drivers. Okay, so we're going to go through, look at conditionals. There really aren't any conditionals that I've put on this step. There might be one that was still hanging around, I don't remember, but it's nothing specific to this test. And then notice here is our command, right? This is the command we're going to run. We're going to start executing that instruction. Here again is the detail for it. All of the switches, and then they're controlled by our variables, right? So I'm going to take this variable out, just copy it, and I'm going to show that to you in just a minute. Okay, but then notice right here, so best match, whether it's true or false, right? We'll see that right there, best match true. All right, OSD driver client. And then we roll on, and you see that there's nothing. We don't find anything. Why? Because this is a Hyper-V machine. I don't have any Hyper-V specific drivers, so I don't have any to download. But you see that we are making the request. We aren't finding anything for all the hardware that we're actually querying against. And then we finish up. Successful, nothing to do, there's no installation, and all good. Right? Well, so let's look at the variables that we stored away. Oh, sorry, C:. If I can type the right thing. There, that's what I want. So if I search this file for the variable name that I copied out of the logs, I should see it, and I'll be able to see the values for it. Right? So this, remember the last discussion we had about dumping variables? I'm just using that to be able to see what's going on. So this is the variable being used in the command line. And then I will find out the property, right? So here's the variable, best match is set to true, right? So in this case, we know we're going to be looking for the best match to see what's going on, right? That's how we can use the variables to interpret what's happening. All right, so let's move on. I'm going to go ahead and close this because I'm done with this machine. In fact, I'm going to turn it off. Good enough. Now, let me pull in the management point. So here's the management point, and we'll get to the SQL profiler in just a minute. But first, let's look at the corresponding log on the management point. So if I go into SMSCCM, logs, and the MP underscores, there's one called driver manager. Right? So if we open that up, we will see, in fact, at our timestamp, here's where it all started. Right? We can see, hey, we've got a request. We're parsing the request. We're executing the request to match, executing driver request match, and then we're retrieving the results response to the client sent, and we're all good to go, right? So good enough. That doesn't tell us a lot, but it does tell us that we've actually tried to do something about drivers. Well, what did we actually do, right? Well, that's where SQL Profiler comes in, because this log is not the most verbose, but SQL Profiler will tell us everything that happened. So I'm just going to go ahead and cheat because I know what I'm looking for. You could actually, if you didn't, you could line up the timestamps of the SQL Profiler trace to the timestamps in the log to get into the area of the trace where the log was running. But in my case, again, I know what I'm looking for. So I'm just going to look for the name driver, and I'm going to find previous. And that's a hit, but I don't care about that one. This is the one that I care about. Oh, that's not what I care about either. Up. This is the one I care about. Match drivers. MP_match drivers. And you'll see that there are a lot of parameters that are actually passed in here. Basically, the entire hardware profile of the device is being passed forward. Right? But the key interesting thing here, at least to me, is this. Right? We have a request. The request type is match. Right? And that's it. It's not saying limit to a category. It's saying look at everything in the database and give me a match on what my system needs, right? Cool. So you can look through all the detail of the XML if you like. We won't go into it here. Again, it's just mainly sending up information about the machine, the hardware, so that we can use it in a match. But just bear in mind the first line here, because you'll see a difference here in just a minute. Right? Bear in mind the first line. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and exit or edit this out and clear the trace window. And we'll come back to that. All right, now, the second type of demo that we have is where we want to leverage plug and play, but we want to do it in a way that is very specific. And I like this one a lot, right? Now, with all of these variants of things you can do with really a lot in OSD, but certainly with driver management, there's pluses and minuses. There's use case scenarios where things make sense and others don't. We'll cover, in general, some of those in just a minute. But specifically, notice that I've expanded now, and instead of having one step that does the apply drivers, I've got 4 steps, right? Now, I've kind of cobbled these together. They're not real drivers and so on, but the idea is if you are a Dell Latitude 820, you're going to want to apply the drivers in this step, right? And notice that I've set to install all compatible drivers just as a difference, and this time I've limited only to the category Dell Latitude 820. So if I come in here, notice the options are set to say, query WMI and make sure the model equals this. Now, again, that's just an example. I don't even think Dell Latitude 820 puts it in WMI that way, but it gives you an idea, right? We're only going to run this step if we're a Dell Latitude 820. Corresponding, we also will have a filter for Lenovo 1234, right? And we will only use from that category. And we have a filter, except I called it ABCD here, for Lenovo to make sure only Lenovo's hit that. Same for IBM, right? 4 categories we can choose from here. And then, again, IBM test book, which is not a real name. And then finally, I have my virtual machine. So in my virtual machine, key here, I'm picking 2 categories. Keep that in mind, 2 categories, right? Again, install all compatible drivers, limit driver matching to only consider drivers in the select groups that I have. And then my match here, this is a real match. In my model, I call it a virtual machine because I am a virtual machine. So as I run through this, we're going to run through all 4 steps, but you're going to notice that the first 3 evaluate to false, so we don't do anything there. We only do something on step number 4. All right, so let's cancel that out. I will go ahead and start my profiler again so I can capture everything. All right, that's running. And now I'll pull that to the side and pull in just my test number 2. I'm also paused at the step just before drivers go in. So I will resume and let that go through. And this time you'll see that we're going to run through all 4 steps, right? I'm going to go ahead and hit F8 so that I have the command prompt up. Taking a couple of seconds here as we work through. Should be about to roll over. There we go. Now we're contacting servers to find compatible drivers. We still need to. Notice we're at virtual machine, and we just evaluated those really quickly. we still need to contact the machine to find matching because we need to see what we have, right? We're still being dynamic. I'm going to go ahead and stop the profiler trace at this stage because we've moved on, right? But let's look at the difference in the logs, or if there is any. There we go. So I'll pull this down. Again, I don't care about the rest of it, but I will simply go down and search up. All right, so completed the action. Now, this is for virtual machines specifically, but I want to go up to see some of the others. So I won't go through all of them. We would see all 4 steps are in here, but this is the first one for IBM x64, right? And so I'll show this to you just to show the logic. So we go through here. We have a query that we need to run. Oh, sorry, I didn't get it far enough. Here we go. So apply device drivers, executing the instruction, up even more. The action, oh, there we go. I think we're in the right place. Here's the starting the instructions for IBM. The Lenovo is right above it. So I'm starting the instruction. Here's the query for the model, IBM Testbook ABC, and we notice that the condition evaluated to false. So all we're doing is we're simply skipping because the condition has not been met, right? So that's how we control what drivers actually get applied in this scenario, that along with categories. So then we roll on down and look for the starting of execution for virtual machine. This is one we expect to actually do something, right? So as we roll down, we'll see the same kind of things that we saw before. We have this query, we evaluate it to true, therefore we're going to go into it. Then we start executing the command line. Notice here's our variable again, exactly like we saw. And scroll on down and we see the command line. Notice now that before the variable was set to true because we did want the best match. Now the variable is set to false because we said no, we don't want the best match. We want all compatible drivers. So if you remember what I had in the task sequence, you saw, let me pull it back in just to remind you. In this task sequence, I told it I don't want all or the best drivers. I only want all compatible drivers. So give me everything. Right? That's the difference that you see in the log. All right, we'll come back to that for profiler in just a minute. And the same variable, notice it's exactly the same variable that we saw, and we'll look for this again in the logs, or in the variable dump. Right? So if I go to C drive, then search for this, I should find it, and find it again. We'll see the variable is set to false. Right there. Okay. So knowing what the variables are set to, if you're really trying to understand why things are happening in the task sequence log itself will tell you really good information about how things are running. But sometimes it's helpful to go directly to the variables and see how they're set, right? And that's why understanding variables and the discussion we had last time about variables, how to dump them and different things is useful. So I'll go ahead and close that out. Turn it off. And notice when I close the command prompt, so just a tangent, whenever the imaging completed that stage in PE, you saw the restart window come up that I said, dismiss, and the system didn't restart because the command prompt was up, but it was triggered to restart. So as soon as I drop that command prompt, the system does restart, which is what you saw. All right, now, so there's a third scenario. Oh, before I do that, before I talk about the third scenario, let's go to the site server again and look at the logs. So we have the management point log that we were just looking at. Then we saw it roll over again at 35. So let's see if there's any difference here. Right? So like before, we see the request come in, and is that right here? Right here is the last one. Right here. So it doesn't look all that different. We're calling it a match. We're doing all these things. Is there anything really different about this? Well, let's look. So I'm going to close out the MP log because the next demo doesn't even touch the MP. So I'll get rid of that and look in Profiler. Right? So if I pull Profiler down to the bottom and then search up again for driver, So a couple of hits, there we go, npm match drivers. So all of the same detail that we saw before is here, but notice this time there is a difference, right? So we are still asking for a match, but this time notice we are specifying the categories that we want. So if you think back on the step in the task sequence that I was showing you, there were two categories that I was allowing a match from. Both of them are listed right here. Now they're not user readable. I mean, you can certainly translate those back. But now we're saying, no, don't get every match from every category. Get it from just these two. Right? Which, slight difference, but important to understand that we do track that and we do show that. So I'll close this too because we no longer need it. Again, we don't, in the third demo here, we don't even hit the management point. So the third way that we can do this is by using what are called driver packages. So in the previous two examples, we were using the default auto apply drivers step. There is another one called apply driver package, and that's what we're going to use, right? Yeah, I have an option on it to make sure that I'm a virtual machine. Don't really even need that, but I just put it on. And notice here, there is no configuration. The only configuration there is tell it a driver package, right? So this is where it gets into, if you want to use apply driver packages or drivers from a driver package step, you need to have your driver packages organized in a way that you can maybe point to the Lenovo machine or Lenovo model or the Dell 820 or whatever, and know that you just have the drivers for that machine there, right? And so driver packages are a really cool way to control drivers and make sure that you get exactly what you want. But there also are a few nuances about it that you need to understand. We'll cover those in a minute. Right? Let me show you this thing in action, right? So just like before, I'll pull in one of my test machines, waiting for the install driver part and see how it works. So let me go back to it. Here's my last machine. There, pull it in, and let it fire up. So F8 again, there's my command prompt, and waiting for it to do its thing. And you'll notice that it's actually gonna look a little bit different now because it's going to have a package to refer to instead of actually trying to go to the management point. Okay, there we go. So I'm dumping variables, applying driver package. First thing I have to do before I can apply anything is download the driver package, which that will be a key factor in just a minute. So I'm not going to wait for this to do every single thing. I'm going to let it apply a couple of drivers because really it's just a repeat after that, different drivers. And then we'll look at the log. Okay, so we've gone enough. Probably let me pull that down and open it up. Right? So if I go down in the log, so here I want to look at the step apply driver. When I'm searching, again, you can search by the step name. You want apply driver package as the search criteria. So I'll do that. Find up in my search. Oops. Apply driver package. Oh, I need to put my cursor down. That's why. There we go. So here we go. Let's see. Starting execution of action. Apply driver package virtual machine. I do have that conditional. It evaluates to true. Here's my command line. Notice it's different. Now I'm just saying simply install everything from this driver package. So I've got to apply the driver package. I've got to download it. You'll see the request. Here's a DAV response that you can read through if you're really bored. A lot of detail there. And then we're going and getting all the files out of the package. We're downloading them to our cache. Okay. And then we'll roll on through a little bit more. And then finally, we'll get all this done, all of this downloaded, and then you'll see we're just going to keep installing, just one right after the other. We're going to call, where is it? Sorry, here, DISM, right, to install the driver. So all of this happens in Windows PE. So DISM is our tool. You could use it manually. If we would have actually had a driver match on the first two demos, you would see DISM being used in that case too to install the drivers. We didn't have any to install, so DISM never came up. But here we do have some because we're just saying, here's a package, go install everything, right? And then when the OS boots, it'll figure out what to use. All right. And so we just roll through that, and the drivers get installed, and everything's good to go. All right. Okay. So, yeah, good enough. That's really the difference. And the third option now, there are some caveats. Let me go ahead and turn this off. There are some caveats that need to be considered when looking at this. Actually, before we get to that, let's talk about one other thing. So fail-safe planning, right? So that's how we can install drivers. That's how we can match drivers, right, for all the options available. But it could be that you're in a scenario where you have all the drivers that you've built out in your task sequence, you're trying to get them loaded, but for whatever reason, your task sequence is not loading those drivers correctly, or maybe you have a machine that someone is imaging that you didn't know was a model in your environment, so the right drivers are not there for the task sequence or for that machine. So you want to control for that eventuality and make sure that you have at least the base generic drivers that should work on the vast majority of machines available, so that you can at least have network access and things like that to remediate, right? So there's some ways that we can inject logic into the task sequence to control for those kinds of things. So let me show you a task sequence I've modified that accounts for that, or is a sample of accounting for that. Let's pull in the lab here, and we'll take a look. So here's the lab. So what I've done, I put together this little sample, right? I'll just tell you what I'm going to show you here is really, I'm trying to show you to kind of give you an idea of what you can do. I'm not promising this will cover every scenario the right way. You know, you might even find some flaw in what I've done because I just put it together real quick. But at least it gives you an idea of the kinds of things you can do, right? So I've taken this task sequence and I've modified it a bit to handle a failover condition. So here is the modification. So you see that I've taken all of my apply drivers steps and I've tucked them under a new group called apply drivers. Right? So the idea is you only want to enter the apply drivers step if you have a known model of machine. Right? So I've got conditionals on this group to simply say if any of these conditions are evaluated to be true, meaning it is a known system that we should have drivers for, then cool, we're going to enter into this group. Right? If it's not a known system, we're just going to bypass this group altogether and get down to the apply generic drivers section, right? Well, if I look at the apply generic, well, let's look at this for a minute. So if we do make it inside of the apply drivers step, we're going to have a variable that we're going to set to basically say, hey, we're in the apply drivers section. Apply drivers section entered is set to true, right? Then we're going to go through and apply all of these, right? And if there's an error that happens, then we should record that in the variables. I'm not really controlling for it here, but the idea is you can set another variable to say drivers section completed without error, and it's true. If there's an error in here at any point, because these sections are set not to continue on error, then we will not even get here, right? We'll just pass control back up. We've talked about that in one of our earlier discussions. And knowing how to set continue on error appropriately is going to be important for controlling logic flow. It's not something that you want to do in every case, but maybe, for example, if I have this set to not continue on error, right? If I hit an error right here and I don't have it set to continue on error, then I'm going to hand control back up here. Well, if I do, I don't, but if I do have this set to continue on error, that means I'm just going to continue with the next group right here. Well, guess what? In this case, I have set apply driver section entered apply drivers section entered. That's true. Since I blew up right here, I never get to this point to say that this one's true. So what I've got is a conditional on here to simply say, hey, if any of these sections are true, then go ahead and enter here. So I'm saying if the apply driver section entered is not equal to true, which it will be because I've gotten this far, but if I don't hit this section, it won't be equal to true, right? So I'll handle. Well, if I get here and I blow up, I've not had a chance to set this to true. So I'm saying, if it's not equal to true here, then I want to enter this. The point is, there are two conditions where I want to enter this group. One is I haven't entered the section successfully. I've not passed this marker, so I've not gotten here. So I definitely know I need to apply a generic driver. Or maybe I blew up somewhere above, so just to be safe, I want to apply the generic drivers, right? again, may not fit the exact scenario, but maybe you get the sense of the logic that can be put in place, right? All right. So let's pull this out, and we'll just talk through a couple of these other things. So in terms of drivers and deployment options, there are two options on your deployment. Let me actually show you. I said we'll talk through it. I'll show this to you. So if I go and create a deployment of this, I have an option. Well, first of all, I have to save the collection, so whatever. We're not going to actually do it. But I have an option. As I get further, notice that I set this make available only to ConfigMgr clients. Well, because of that setting, I have two choices here, right? If I did not make the setting to be available to ConfigMgr clients, all I would have is this option, right? So let's talk through those. So if you have if you are considering using the option that says download content locally when needed by the running task sequence, know that is only a choice you can make if you're deploying to a live ConfigMgr client, a reimage scenario. If you're doing a bare metal deployment, that is the only choice you have, so it's not really a choice, you've got to do that, right? Which it simply means, as the task sequence runs, if there's software that we need, we just download it on the fly and continue with the task sequence. The downside of that is it does take a little bit extra time during the task sequence maybe to get all that downloaded. The positive side is you only download what you need, right? Well, the other option, download all content locally before starting the task sequence, again, is only an option whenever you're initiating the task sequence from a ConfigMgr client. But if you do that, we are going to download all of the content locally prior to the task sequence initializing, right? Now, there's another flag. If it's an available task sequence, we're not going to download anything, right? But if it's a required task sequence, just like any other required deployment, we'll download what we need on the fly or ahead of time so that it's available locally whenever we kick off the running task sequence. All right, and so it's a really good option, but here's the other thing. If we download all the content locally, then we're going to download all the content the task sequence might need. So we're going to download stuff that we may not ever need in the running task sequence, right? So that's really the only two real disadvantages of using the download content locally before running the task sequence is additional disk space, additional network load to get the extra content that you might not need. But the advantages are significant. The advantage is that you run everything locally when the task sequence kicks off instead of having to go across the network to fetch it. Right now, this doesn't work for every step. Those dynamic steps for drivers, as we showed in example 1 and 2, it doesn't know what content to download, so it's not going to download anything, right, until it gets to that step. So you have to understand how the flow works and what happens at various steps to know what to expect in these, but it's definitely a couple of options to understand. Now, there also is going to be a difference in what you can do depending on the kind of imaging option you choose. We have bare metal, which includes both boot media and PXE as well as standalone media. There are differences here. So in terms of boot media and PXE, the dynamic download of content is going to be possible and what you probably want, right? Because as we're running through the task sequence, in a bare metal scenario, all you have is download on demand, download when needed. And so when we dynamically ask for the drivers, then we'll download what we need at the time. So in that case where we have 4 models listed in the task sequence, we only are ever going to image one model at a time, so we'll only download the drivers for the one model we need versus downloading all 4, right? Now, that's not true when it comes to standalone media, right? Standalone media, by definition, expects no network access. So the steps to dynamically provision drivers assume that you can get to the network, which in a standalone media scenario, you can't. You're assumed to not be able to, right? So in a standalone media scenario, you're going to want to use the option of driver packages versus dynamically asking for the drivers. The downside of that is we're going to have to store all of the potential content on the standalone media, so you're going to have a larger standalone media just to make sure all the content we might ever need is there. Right? Now, in reality, you can have standalone media that does have network access. Right? I've done it. I know of people that do it. It's kind of a hybrid mode. Just know that it's possible. I won't dig into that here. But standalone media was designed for no network connectivity at all. Now, in a reimage scenario, we again assume that the task sequence is going to be ConfigMgr client initiated. The dynamic download of the content is definitely possible here, as well as the ahead of time provisioning of the content, right? So other things to talk about for sure, but that really does wrap up this session. Pretty end-to-end look at the possibilities for driver management, some theories around driver management, actually choosing which one works for you in a given scenario will depend on the scenario, and there's a lot of flexibility here, a lot of options to choose from. So we'll wrap it here, and we will continue talking about OSD in our next session.